The strange thing about losing a marriage is that sometimes it doesn't happen during a fight. It happens during a sentence so casual, so effortless, that everyone else at the table keeps eating while your entire future quietly falls apart. My name is Nathan Cole. I'm 42 years old, born and raised in Texas, the owner of a commercial construction company that spent nearly 2 decades turning empty lots into office buildings, medical centers, and shopping plazas across the state. I believed in hard work. I believed in loyalty. And for 12 years, I believed in my wife. Looking back now, I can pinpoint the exact moment that belief started to die. It happened on a Friday night at a steakhouse outside Dallas. One of those places with dark wood walls, leather booths, and waiters who somehow knew when to refill your drink before you asked. Melissa and I were there with 3 other couples, friends we'd known for years. The conversation was light. Vacations, work, rising property taxes. The usual things married people talk about when they've known each other long enough to stop trying to impress anyone. I remember the sound of ice shifting inside my glass. I remember the smell of grilled ribeye drifting across the table. I remember thinking it had been a pretty good week. Then someone mentioned old relationships. It started as a joke. One harmless story turned into another. Everybody laughed. Everybody shared something. Then Melissa smiled and brought up Brandon. Brandon Hayes, her ex-boyfriend. The man she had dated before we met. At first, nobody thought much of it. Why would they? Over the years, Brandon's name had appeared now and then like an old photograph tucked inside a drawer. A text message here. A social media comment there. Nothing dramatic. Nothing obvious. At least that's what I told myself. Melissa laughed and took a sip of wine. Then she said something that made a few people at the table exchange amused glances. Nathan still gets weird whenever Brandon comes up. More laughter followed. Friendly laughter. The kind people use when they think they're witnessing a harmless disagreement between spouses. I forced a smile. I don't get weird, I said. I just think some boundaries make life easier. Melissa rolled her eyes. Not angrily. Not dramatically. Almost like she'd rehearsed the motion. You always say that. One of our friends chuckled. Come on, Nathan. You're not jealous of a guy from 20 years ago. I wasn't interested in arguing. I took another sip of whiskey and let the conversation move on. But Melissa didn't. She leaned back in her chair and crossed her arms. Honestly, she said, I don't know why this is even a discussion. Her voice wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. The entire table went quiet anyway. Then she smiled and delivered the sentence that would stay with me for months afterward. Brandon is part of my life. He always will be. And you can't stop me. The words landed softly. No shouting. No hostility. Just certainty. Around the table, people shifted uncomfortably. Someone stared into their drink. Someone else suddenly became interested in the menu. I sat there holding my glass, feeling the cold condensation against my fingers. Melissa looked completely relaxed, like she had merely stated a fact everyone should already understand. The strange thing is I didn't get angry. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't argue. I just looked at her. Then I nodded once and smiled. You're right, I said quietly. She looked surprised. Maybe she expected resistance. Maybe she expected another conversation she could win. Instead, I finished my drink and listened to everyone awkwardly change the subject. The dinner continued. People laughed again. Dessert arrived. Checks were paid. The evening moved forward. But something inside me stayed behind at that table. At the time, Melissa thought she had won an argument. What neither of us understood was that she had just ended something far more important. Nobody at that restaurant knew what happened after we got home that night. The truth is, nothing happened. No argument. No slammed doors. No dramatic confrontation. Melissa spent most of the drive scrolling through her phone while country music played quietly through the speakers of my Ford F-150. The highway stretched ahead beneath the Texas night, headlights sliding across the pavement in long white ribbons. Every few minutes, she laughed at something on her screen. Every few minutes, I tightened my grip on the steering wheel. Looking back, that silence told me more than any fight ever could. We pulled into our neighborhood just before 10 o'clock. The same neighborhood where we had spent more than a decade building a life together. 2-story homes, trimmed lawns, kids riding bicycles in the afternoons. The kind of place people point to when they talk about stability. Melissa headed inside first. I stayed in the driveway for a moment longer than usual. The porch light cast a warm glow across the brick exterior of the house. I remembered standing in that same driveway 12 years earlier after we bought the place. Back then, Neither of us had much. I was still running construction projects myself, wearing steel-toe boots 6 days a week and handling problems from sunrise until long after dark. Melissa was climbing her way through the marketing world, taking every opportunity she could find. We were not rich. We were not connected. We were just two people willing to work hard. That was enough. At least, it used to be. I built my company one contract at a time. Small retail spaces became larger developments. Larger developments became long-term partnerships. There were years when I barely saw daylight outside of a job site. Summers where the Texas heat felt hot enough to melt asphalt. Winters spent reviewing contracts at the kitchen table long after midnight. Melissa used to sit beside me during those nights. She would bring coffee, ask questions about projects, laugh whenever I complained about permits and inspections. Back then, we felt like a team. The success came gradually. Nothing flashy. No overnight fortune. Just thousands of early mornings and thousands of decisions that nobody else ever saw. By the time I turned 40, the company employed dozens of people. We had a comfortable life. Vacations when schedules allowed it. Financial security. A house free from mortgage payments. Looking from the outside, most people would have called it a success story. But success has a strange way of hiding cracks. The larger our lives became, the less time we seemed to spend inside them together. Melissa's career accelerated too. Conferences, networking events, business dinners, more flights, more weekends away. I told myself it was normal. Successful people stay busy. Mature marriages adapt. That is what I believed. The truth was simpler. I trusted her. Completely. The thought that trust might be misplaced never crossed my mind. Even when small things started changing. Even when conversations became shorter. Even when evenings felt quieter. You tell yourself relationships go through seasons. You tell yourself stress explains distance. You tell yourself everything is fine because admitting otherwise feels harder. That night, after Melissa went upstairs, I stayed alone in the living room. The television was on, but I could not have told you what was playing. My eyes kept drifting toward the family photographs on the bookshelf. Vacations, holidays, birthdays, 12 years captured inside wooden frames. For the first time, I found myself wondering whether I had been looking at those pictures the wrong way. Because sometimes a marriage does not fall apart when love disappears. Sometimes it begins falling apart when respect quietly leaves the room first. And the more I thought about what Melissa had said at dinner, the more I realized that sentence had not appeared out of nowhere. The warning signs had been there long before that night. I just had not understood what they meant. The first time I noticed Brandon becoming more than just a name was on a Tuesday afternoon. I was reviewing bids for a medical office project outside Fort Worth when Melissa sent me a text. Lunch with Brandon. Catching up. Back around 2. There was nothing inappropriate about it on the surface. Old friends have lunch. Former classmates reconnect. Mature adults do not panic every time an old relationship crosses paths with their current one. That is exactly what I told myself. So I replied with a thumbs up and went back to work. Looking back, I wish I could tell you there was one giant warning sign. One obvious moment when common sense should have grabbed me by the shoulders and shaken me awake. There was not. It happened slowly, quietly, like a crack spreading through concrete beneath fresh paint. A few weeks later, Brandon's name appeared again. Then again. Then again. At first it was stories. Brandon got promoted. Brandon bought a new house. Brandon was thinking about moving back to Texas permanently. Brandon remembered that restaurant they used to visit in college. Small details. Harmless details. The kind of details people only remember when they think about someone often. I noticed it. Then I ignored it. Melissa seemed happier whenever she talked about him. More energetic. More engaged. There was a spark in her voice I had not heard directed toward me in a long time. That realization hurt more than I wanted to admit. One evening I came home after a 12-hour day at a construction site. My boots were covered in dust. My shirt smelled faintly of concrete and summer heat. Melissa was sitting on the couch smiling at her phone. I walked in and said hello. She barely looked up. Her fingers continued moving across the screen. A few seconds later she laughed. Not a polite laugh. A real one. The kind that reaches someone's eyes. I stood there holding my keys and suddenly felt like a guest inside my own house. She finally glanced up. Sorry, she said. Brandon just sent something funny. Then she went right back to typing. It sounds small now. Maybe it was small. But marriages are built from small things. Attention. Respect. Presence. When those things start moving elsewhere, people notice, even when they pretend they do not. Soon there were phone calls. Most happened during the day. Some happened at night. Melissa always had an explanation ready. Brandon needed advice. Brandon was dealing with a difficult situation. Brandon wanted a second opinion about a career move. Every explanation sounded reasonable. That was the problem. Reasonable explanations make doubt feel selfish. So I kept swallowing my concerns and telling myself I was being unfair. But a strange pattern was emerging. The more Brandon entered our lives, the less present Melissa seemed in our marriage. Conversations became shorter. Dinners became quieter. Plans were interrupted by texts arriving at all hours. Every time I started questioning it, I remembered that dinner conversation and pushed the thought away. Maybe I was overreacting. Maybe I was imagining things. Maybe trust required patience. Then one Saturday morning, while Melissa was in the shower, her phone lit up on the kitchen counter. I was not trying to snoop. I was pouring coffee when the screen flashed. A message preview appeared. Brandon's name. One sentence. Looking forward to seeing you tonight. I stared at the words for several seconds. Tonight. Nobody had mentioned any plans for tonight. And for the first time, something cold settled deep inside my chest. Because suddenly I realized I was learning about parts of my wife's life after someone else already knew about them. That message stayed in my head for the rest of the morning. Looking forward to seeing you tonight. Simple words. Ordinary words. Yet I could not stop thinking about them. Melissa came downstairs 20 minutes later dressed for the day, coffee in one hand, phone in the other. If she noticed something had changed in me, she never showed it. She kissed my cheek, checked a notification, and sat at the kitchen island scrolling through her screen. I waited. Part of me expected her to mention her plans. Another part already knew she would not. Sure enough, she never said a word. By noon I was standing on a construction site outside Arlington, watching a crew install steel framing under a bright Texas sky. Nail guns echoed through the air. Forklifts moved across packed dirt. Radios played somewhere in the distance. Normally, work helped me clear my mind. That day it did not. Every time I checked my phone, I thought about that message. Every time I tried focusing on schedules and budgets, my thoughts drifted back home. When I finally returned that evening, Melissa was already getting ready. She stood in front of the bathroom mirror, adjusting an earring. The smell of perfume drifted through the room. Going somewhere? I asked casually. She glanced at me through the reflection. Just meeting a few people for drinks. A few people. Not Brandon. Not the plan from the message. Just a few people. The answer was technically true. That was what bothered me. Half-truths have a way of sounding honest while hiding everything that matters. Who was going? I asked. Her expression changed instantly. Not dramatically. Just enough. A slight tightening around her eyes. A fraction of a second. Then it disappeared. Why? She asked. Just making conversation. She laughed softly. You are acting strange lately. Strange. I remember that word because it stayed with me. Not concerned. Not curious. Strange. Somehow the conversation ended with me defending a simple question. That happened more often than I cared to admit. The next few weeks followed the same pattern. Brandon appeared everywhere without physically being there. Phone calls, messages, stories, plans, references. If I asked anything, Melissa became irritated. If I said nothing, she seemed perfectly comfortable. One evening, we were watching television when her phone buzzed 3 times in a row. She picked it up immediately and started typing. 5 minutes passed. Then 10. The television continued playing to an audience of 1. Finally, I asked, "Everything okay?" She sighed heavily as if I had interrupted something important. "It is Brandon." Another pause. "He is going through a rough time." I nodded. "I hope things work out for him." That should have been the end of it. Instead, she lowered the phone and stared at me. "You know, not everything is about you." The room went quiet. I had not accused her of anything. I had not argued. Yet somehow I found myself apologizing. Looking back, that was the moment I stopped trying to understand the situation and started observing it. I stopped debating. I stopped defending myself. I stopped chasing explanations. Instead, I paid attention. Patterns began emerging everywhere. Melissa guarded her phone more carefully than ever. She took calls outside. She became defensive over harmless questions. Most telling of all, she protected Brandon with an intensity she no longer reserved for our marriage. The realization settled slowly, like dust after a storm. Whatever role Brandon played in her life, it was becoming more important than the role I occupied. And the hardest part was not what she was doing. The hardest part was realizing she no longer cared whether I noticed. The night everything finally shifted happened about 3 weeks later. One of Melissa's co-workers was celebrating a promotion, and a group of friends rented a private room at an upscale restaurant in downtown Dallas. It was the kind of place with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city skyline, white tablecloths, and cocktails that cost more than my first hourly wage. I almost did not go. I had spent the entire day visiting job sites under 90-degree heat, and all I wanted was a shower and a quiet evening. Melissa insisted. "It will be good for us to get out," she said. So I went. At first, the evening felt normal. People laughed. Stories flowed around the table. Glasses clinked. Servers moved through the room, carrying trays of food. I sat beside Melissa listening more than talking, content to let everyone else enjoy the spotlight. Then Brandon arrived. He was not originally on the guest list. At least not the version Melissa had told me about. Yet somehow there he was, walking into the room like he belonged there. Melissa's face lit up the moment she saw him. That expression hit me harder than I expected. Not because it was romantic, not because it was inappropriate, because it was enthusiastic, genuine, familiar, the kind of expression I had not seen directed toward me in a very long time. Brandon took a seat only a few chairs away. The conversation naturally drifted toward old memories, college stories, mutual friends, places they used to visit years ago. I stayed quiet, not angry, not jealous, just watching, observing, the same thing I had been doing for weeks. At one point, someone asked how Melissa and I met. Before I could answer, Brandon laughed and said, "Honestly, I still think I knew her better than anybody." Several people chuckled. Melissa laughed too. Then she nodded, like it was a reasonable thing to say in front of her husband. Something inside me went still. The room remained cheerful. Nobody seemed to notice. A few minutes later, another friend jokingly asked whether former relationships could ever truly stay in the past. Brandon answered first. Melissa answered second. Both seemed to have strong opinions. Then all eyes turned toward me. I remember setting my glass down carefully before speaking. "I think every marriage needs healthy boundaries," I said calmly. The room fell quiet for a second. Nothing dramatic. Just a pause. Melissa immediately rolled her eyes. "There he goes again," she said with a laugh. A few people smiled awkwardly. One person looked down at the table. Another reached for a drink. The conversation could have ended there. It should have ended there. Instead, Melissa kept talking. She explained how some people were too sensitive, how friendships should not require permission, how mature adults should not feel threatened by history. Nobody challenged her. Nobody needed to. The damage was already done. Sitting there, surrounded by people, I felt strangely invisible. Not because anyone insulted me, not because anyone attacked me, because my perspective no longer mattered to the person who once valued it most. For the rest of the evening, I barely spoke. I listened. I observed. And somewhere between dessert and the final round of drinks, I realized something important. I was no longer fighting to save the relationship. I was only waiting to see how much further it would drift before it disappeared completely. What I did not know then was that my decision had already begun forming. Quietly, permanently, and sooner than anyone expected, I was going to stop explaining myself altogether. After that dinner, I stopped trying to win conversations. The strange thing was Melissa did not seem to notice. Most people expect major decisions to arrive with a dramatic moment. A fight, a betrayal, a confession. Mine arrived quietly on a Monday morning while I was drinking coffee before sunrise. The house was silent. The neighborhood outside still slept beneath the pale blue light of dawn. I sat alone at the kitchen table listening to the hum of the refrigerator and realized I was exhausted. Not physically, emotionally. Exhausted from explaining why certain things bothered me. Exhausted from being told my concerns were unreasonable. Exhausted from feeling like a guest inside my own marriage. For the first time, I stopped asking myself how to fix the situation. Instead, I asked a different question. What would my life look like if I stopped fighting for something the other person no longer valued? The answer surprised me. It felt peaceful. Over the next few weeks, nothing changed on the surface. I still went to work every day. I still came home every evening. Melissa continued her routines. We attended social events. We ate dinner together. From the outside, everything appeared normal. Underneath, an entirely different process had begun. I met with a financial advisor. Quietly, professionally, nothing dramatic, just preparation. I reviewed business records, personal accounts, property documents, and long-term plans. The same careful attention that helped me build a company was now being applied to my future. Looking back, I think part of me had already accepted what was coming. Melissa remained focused on her own world. Brandon's name still surfaced regularly. Messages still arrived. Calls still happened. Whenever I noticed, I no longer reacted. That seemed to confuse her more than any argument ever had. One evening she looked up from her phone and asked, "You have been awfully quiet lately." I smiled. "Just busy." She studied me for a second before returning to her screen. The conversation ended there. The truth was simple. I had stopped chasing explanations. Once you stop chasing, you start seeing things clearly. The house itself began feeling different. I noticed details I used to ignore. The creak in the hallway floorboards. The sound of the sprinkler system turning on before sunrise. The empty side of conversations that used to last hours. Sometimes Melissa would spend an entire evening scrolling through messages while sitting 3 feet away from me on the couch. We were together physically, but separated by something far greater than distance. One Friday afternoon, I left a meeting early and drove home. Rain clouds hung low over the city. The windshield wipers moved steadily across the glass. I remember feeling unusually calm. Not angry, not sad, just calm. When I walked through the front door, I realized something important. The fear was gone. For months, I had feared losing the marriage. Feared what change would look like. Feared being alone. Suddenly, none of those fears remained. In their place was clarity. Clarity can be a dangerous thing because once you see the truth, you cannot return to pretending. That evening I sat alone on the back patio watching dark clouds gather over the Texas sky. Thunder rolled somewhere in the distance. Inside the house, Melissa laughed at something on her phone. The sound drifted through the screen door. For the first time, I did not feel hurt by it. I felt finished. And deep down, I knew the next step was no longer a question of if. It was only a question of when. The morning I left looked exactly like every other morning. That was the strange part. The sky over Dallas was clear. The coffee maker started brewing at 6 o'clock. The neighborhood sprinklers clicked on 1 yard at a time. Nothing about the world suggested that a 12-year marriage was reaching its final chapter. Melissa was still asleep when I got out of bed. I stood quietly in the doorway for a moment and looked around the room. The furniture, the photographs, the familiar routine that had defined so much of my adult life. I did not feel anger. I did not feel revenge. Mostly, I felt tired. Tired of carrying a relationship that no longer felt shared. Over the previous month, I had prepared carefully. A furnished apartment across town. Updated financial records. Conversations with attorneys. Every decision had been made calmly, methodically, without drama. I packed only what I needed. A few suitcases. Work clothes. Personal documents. Family keepsakes that belonged to me. The process took less than an hour. Years of emotional weight reduced to a handful of boxes. Looking back, that realization hurt more than I expected. Before leaving, I sat at the kitchen table and wrote a letter. Not a long one. Not an angry one. There were no accusations. No list of grievances. No attempt to win an argument. I simply wrote the truth. I explained that I could no longer participate in a marriage where respect had become optional. I explained that I wished her well and hoped she found whatever future she was searching for. Most importantly, I explained that my decision was final. I folded the paper and placed it beside her coffee mug. Then I picked up my truck keys and walked out the front door. The air felt cool against my face. Somewhere nearby, a dog barked. A delivery truck rolled through the neighborhood. Life continued exactly as it always had. I climbed into my truck and drove away without looking back. Around 8:30, my phone started vibrating. Melissa. I let it ring. Then another call came. Then another. By noon, there were texts. Questions at first. Then confusion. Then urgency. Where are you? What is going on? Why are you not answering? I read every message and responded to none of them. Not because I wanted to punish her. Because there was nothing left to explain. The explanation had already been ignored for months. By late afternoon, she called from a different number. Then another. Friends started reaching out. One asked whether everything was okay. Another said Melissa seemed upset. I thanked them for their concern and kept my answers short. Meanwhile, I sat inside my new apartment overlooking a small lake on the edge of the city. Sunlight reflected across the water. A pair of ducks moved slowly near the shoreline. For the first time in longer than I could remember, the silence felt peaceful instead of lonely. That evening, a final message arrived from Melissa. It was shorter than the others. Just one sentence. I did not think you would actually leave. I stared at those words for a long time. Then I placed my phone face down on the table. Because for the first time, she was beginning to understand something I had known for weeks. The man she thought would always stay had already walked away long before he left the house. The first few weeks after I left were surprisingly quiet. There were still occasional messages from Melissa, but they became less frequent as time passed. Attorneys handled most communication. Practical matters replaced emotional conversations. The distance that once felt impossible became normal. Meanwhile, life continued moving forward. My company remained busy. New projects filled the calendar. Mornings started early. Meetings stretched across counties. Crews broke ground on developments that would take years to complete. For the first time in a long while, I found myself focusing completely on work without carrying the constant weight of unresolved tension back home. Then something interesting happened. People started talking. Not gossip in the dramatic sense. Just observations. Mutual friends would mention seeing Melissa more often. Networking events. Social gatherings. Dinners. Brandon seemed to be around frequently. None of that surprised me. Looking back, I think she expected life to continue exactly as before, only without the difficult conversations. She expected freedom from boundaries without losing the stability that came with them. The problem was that reality rarely works that way. Around 3 months after I left, one of our mutual friends called me. We spent 20 minutes discussing business before he hesitated and changed the subject. You know, he said carefully, Melissa seems different lately. I asked what he meant. There was a long pause. Unhappy, he finally said. The word stayed with me after the call ended. Not because it gave me satisfaction. It did not. Contrary to what people think, watching someone struggle rarely feels as good as revenge fantasies make it sound. Mostly it feels sad, especially when that person was once the center of your world. Over the following months, little pieces of information continued reaching me. Brandon was not the solution she imagined. The excitement that comes from revisiting the past has a way of colliding with reality. Shared history is not the same thing as a shared future. Old memories cannot carry the weight of everyday life forever. Eventually, the novelty fades and ordinary life returns. Bills, responsibilities, expectations, the same realities every adult faces. One afternoon, nearly 6 months after leaving, I ran into an old friend at a construction conference in Houston. During lunch, he mentioned seeing Melissa recently. She asked about you, he said. I nodded but said nothing. He stirred his iced tea and continued. Honestly, Nathan, I think she finally understands what she lost. I looked out the restaurant window at the traffic moving through the city. For years, I would have waited desperately to hear words like that. For years, I wanted recognition, validation, understanding. Yet sitting there, I felt none of those things. The strange part was that my life no longer revolved around whether Melissa understood anything. I had spent so much time hoping she would see my perspective that I never realized true peace would arrive when I stopped needing her to. Later that evening, I returned to my apartment overlooking the lake. The sun hung low across the water, turning the surface gold. I sat on the balcony with a cup of coffee and watched the reflection ripple across the shoreline. Somewhere in another part of the city, Melissa was living with the consequences of her choices. And for the first time, I realized I was no longer living with them myself. But what I did not know was that our story was not completely finished. Because before long, Melissa would ask for something she once believed I would always be willing to give. About 8 months after I left, Melissa called me directly. It was the first time I answered. Not because I missed her. Not because I was waiting for the call. Simply because enough time had passed that I no longer felt the need to avoid it. Her voice sounded different. Quieter. Less certain. We exchanged a few polite words before she asked if we could meet. I thought about it for a moment and agreed. A week later, we met at a small coffee shop overlooking a park on the north side of Dallas. It was a mild Saturday morning. Families pushed strollers along walking paths. Dogs chased tennis balls across the grass. The world felt calm. Melissa arrived early. I could tell she was nervous. Not dramatic. Not emotional. Just nervous. For a few minutes, we talked about ordinary things. Work. Mutual friends. The weather. Then the conversation finally reached the reason she had asked to see me. She looked down at her coffee cup before speaking. I made mistakes, Nathan. I nodded but said nothing. She continued. She talked about the months after I left. about realizing how much of our life she had taken for granted, about how certainty can make people careless, about how easy it is to assume someone will always be there until one day they are not. I listened quietly. There was a time when hearing those words would have meant everything to me. There was a time when I would have fought for one more chance, one more conversation, one more promise. But sitting there that morning, I realized something important. The person she was speaking to was no longer the same man she had known. Growth changes people. Distance changes people. Pain changes people. Most of all, peace changes people. When she finally stopped talking, her eyes searched my face. "Is there any chance for us?" she asked softly. The question hung between us. I looked through the window toward the park. Sunlight reflected off the lake beyond the trees. Somewhere in the distance a child laughed. Life kept moving forward. It always does. I turned back toward her and smiled. Not out of bitterness. Not out of triumph. Just acceptance. "I hope you find happiness, Melissa," I said. "I really do." Her expression told me she understood before I said anything else. Some doors closed quietly. No slamming. No anger. No dramatic ending. Just two people finally recognizing they are walking different roads. We finished our coffee. We stood. We wished each other well. Then we walked away in opposite directions. As I crossed the parking lot, I felt lighter than I had in years. Not because someone lost. Not because someone won. Because I finally understood a lesson that took me far too long to learn. Love matters. Loyalty matters. But respect matters too. And once respect disappears, love alone cannot carry the weight forever. That was the last time I saw Melissa. Sometimes I wonder where life eventually took her. I genuinely hope it was somewhere good. As for me, I kept building. New projects. New goals. New chapters. And for the first time in a very long time, the future felt bigger than the past. If you watch this story all the way to the end, what do you think? Would you have made the same decision, or would you have handled it differently? Share your thoughts in the comments. And if stories about resilience, self-respect, and moving forward speak to you, consider subscribing to the channel so you do not miss the next one.